Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michon Boston.
And I'm Taquiena Boston. In this podcast, part one of a two-part conversation, Michon and I talk with award-winning poet, literary activist, and author Ethelbert Miller about A Complete Unknown, the biopic about musician-songwriter Bob Dylan, based on the book by Elijah Wald, Dylan Goes Electric, Newport, Seeger, Dylan, and the Night That Split the Sixties. Directed by James Mangold, who co-wrote the screenplay with Jay Cox, A Complete Unknown is set against the backdrop of a time of dramatic social, cultural, and political change, as a vibrant music scene is happening in New York City. In 1961, 19-year-old Bob Dylan, portrayed by Timothée Chalamet, arrives in New York from Minnesota with his guitar and revolutionary talent, destined to change the course of American music.
On his meteoric rise, Dylan forges intimate relationships with folk music icons Pete Seeger, portrayed by Edward Norton, and ailing Woody Guthrie, portrayed by Scoot McNairy, and folk music star Joan Baez, portrayed by Monica Barbero. The film culminates with Dylan's groundbreaking and controversial performance at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965.
A Complete Unknown also features Elle Fanning as Sylvia Rousseau, an interpretation of Dylan's real-life muse and lover Susie Rotolo, Eriko Hatsune as Toshi Seeger, Norbert Leo Butz as Alan Lomax, Dan Fogler as Dylan's manager Albert Grossman, Boyd Holbrook as singer Johnny Cash, and Michael Chernus and Will Harrison as folk musicians Dave Van Ronk and Bob Newworth.
Taquiena and I saw a preview for A Complete Unknown with Ethelbert Miller and looked forward to this conversation about Dylan, literature, and the social, political, and cultural scene driving the music in the 1960s. Ethelbert Miller has authored 2 memoirs and several poetry collections. He hosts the WPFW morning radio show On the Margin with Ethelbert Miller and hosts and produces The Scholars on UDC TV, which received the 2020 Telly Award. Ethelbert Miller is associate editor and a columnist for the American Book Review. He was given a 2020 Congressional Award from Congressman Jamie Raskin in recognition of his literary activism. In 2022, he received the Howard Zinn Lifetime Achievement Award by the Peace and Justice Studies Association and was named a 2023 Grammy nominee finalist for Best Spoken Word Poetry Album. Ethelbert's latest book is The Little Book of E, published by City Point Press. Recently, he was awarded the Furious Flower Lifetime Achievement Award, which is given every 10 years to a poet or scholar of poetry who's made a significant impact in poetry. In part one of our conversation about A Complete Unknown, Ethelbert Miller shares his story about becoming a poet inspired by Bob Dylan, Paul Simon, and the Greenwich Village folk music scene as he's coming of age in New York in the 1960s. We also talk about Elijah Wald's book, which is more than the story of Dylan going electric at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. It's also the story of Pete Seeger and other folk music heroes building a movement and a community as part of their mission to preserve and celebrate American folk culture and music traditions.
And Michon and I couldn't ignore the preservation work of Alan Lomax, who recorded and gave storytellers and anthropologists like author Zora Neale Hurston the tools and resources to preserve American folk traditions that are available today through the Library of Congress. Ethelbert talks about his coming of age as a writer and mentors who guided him to preserve African American arts and culture, as Lomax did during his lifetime.
Be advised, there are spoilers in our conversation. If you haven't seen A Complete Unknown and you don't like spoilers, best to see the movie first and then come back to this podcast. And stick around after the conversation. we've got a list of books for you to do your own deeper dive. Welcome, Ethelbert, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Well, it's great to be here. I really admire both of you in terms of what you're doing, and I love the fact that your podcast is so successful already.
Well, thank you. And we encourage people to share the podcast with other fans of historical drama and your fans as well, Ethelbert,
Okay.
because I know you have many. So you, Taquiena, and I went together to see a preview in December of A Complete Unknown. While you were watching the film, what memories did the film evoke for you? How was this a window to the times of your youth in New York City and the music, specifically folk music, you were drawn to?
Well, what I like about the film, even before any of the characters appear on the screen, is that there's a reference to Woody Guthrie. If there's one thing that the film does between the years 1961 65, it shows you the connection that Bob Dylan has to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. And I think that's very important. It also highlights two instruments, which I think is very important, affected me. And that is the guitar and the harmonica. I grew up in a household where the emphasis was playing the piano. And I remember, because of folk music, I'm going to get a guitar, right? And the only thing I ever really could play was maybe the first lines of The Sounds of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. That was the only thing I could really play. I could do that.
Yeah.
But I say that in terms of what the film does. It lays a foundation. And sometimes what happens, we just think, okay, how did Bob Dylan, who's responsible for Bob Dylan being developing? What I also looked at closely was how there's two songs in the film that shows the transition. One is Time Is a Changing, which he's singing, and then would be like a Rolling Stone, where you see the music changing. What I also felt was very important was where some of these songs come from, and in terms of, for me, many of the songs that you see in the film, I come to a little later, because these are films that Dylan is writing between 61 and 65, like I said. I'm really getting into Dylan at the age of 14 to 17. So that's 64 to 66, 67. That's when I'm listening to Dylan. And why I think I'm attracted to him, and it's very subtle in the film, he changes his name. It's like, okay, he's Jewish.
Isn't he Zimmerman?
Right. But there's Bob Dylan, so that name change. And I think when I go back and I look at what changed my life, I went to Christopher Columbus High School, and I arrived in high school at 64, 65, and I didn't realize what was happening. I was really being bused. I was being sent to one of the best schools, in New York, after Stuyvesant and Bronx High School of Science. And that was because of what was going on politically, to watch riots, things of that sort. And so it opened up a lot of doors for me. And when I went to Christopher Columbus High School, it was a few black kids from Harlem. I'm from the South Bronx. I really didn't get along with them. The people I got along well with the young people who were Jewish. Okay, so the school was predominantly Italian and Jewish, but I was really attracted to the Jews and who I became friends with. The backdrop of all of this for our lives is the Vietnam War. Okay, and where you greet the age of 17, 18, you're thinking about the draft. Okay, so. And the other thing I would have to add is that my family is background from, Panama and the West Indies. So when you look at that film and Dylan is singing about the civil rights movement and things of that sort, that's not my experience. Okay, that was not part. I was not sent down to Mississippi during the summer to see my grandparents. Okay, so I'm missing that part of the film. The songs that I was affected by Dylan would be later on. Now, as the songs that I'm humming and singing along with, Tambourine Man, Highway 61, and what attracts me to Dylan, and I'm not even thinking about writing poetry. I'm just like the songs, the lines, in one song, like, he can have Cinderella and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. But come on, okay, when you compare that in one line, or you go around singing Tambourine Man, or when Memphis Blues came along, Memphis Blues, or you got that first job, and you say, like, I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more. These lines resonate. I'm saying it jokingly, but for me, unconsciously, it's laying the foundation for me to later become a writer.
Hmm. And it's interesting. I came into Dylan through Nina Simone.
Mm-hmm.
Just like a woman, times they are changing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But
Well,
what?
the one way you know a songwriter is really good is that other people can sing it, and sometimes even better than the original.
Right. Right. And I think about that because I never got into Woody Guthrie. I got into a little bit of Pete Seeger, but what happens is that when you look at Dylan, um, it's only a couple of songs that I really like how Dylan sings. If I had to compare it to the people doing, like you say, Nina Simone, or like Joan Baez singing some of his songs. Um, Knock on Heaven's Door, I like how he sings that. Forever Young, I like
Mhm.
how he sings that. It's a very personal song. So his voice is very important, and that's that. But that is a mark of a good songwriter. That people sing your songs. The other person would be who complimented. I think Bob Dylan complimented him. That's Smokey Robinson. When you think about songwriting, we think of some of those Motown songs. Like, for example, My Girl, for example, might be a song that he wrote for his daughter being born. So those are very interesting things that a songwriter will do, is being honored by somebody else singing their song.
Yeah. Well, Ethelbert, one thing we knew you would do is give us really a very substantive kind of historical context. And you've talked a little bit about how that intersects with your own history. In a previous interview that you did with Michon, you said that when you came to Howard University, you had to hide your folk music albums. This is 1968. So why did you feel the need to hide your musical preference, and what was going on at Howard?
well,
What were
well,
your
I,
peers
well,
listening to?
well, I do remember that Howard discovered the Chambers Brothers. I was into the Chambers Brothers before I came to Howard, but they were like, "Oh man, the Chambers Brothers," and they got a white drummer. Yeah, right. But I say that in terms of one, and this is very important for you listeners. You can define yourself in terms of the music of your life. It
Mhm.
has a lot to do when you're coming of age.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so if you said why is my mother listening to Frank Sinatra or Count Basie, because that was the music. When you think about, okay, I'm coming of age, this is music, I'm dating somebody. Why is this love song important? Because I was going out with so and so, or I met so and so. And so what happens for me, the music, like in high school, I'm listening to Bob Dylan, I'm listening to Phil Oakes, definitely, I'm listening to Buffy St. Marie, I'm listening to folk music. Okay, now I go off to Howard. I go south, south. Okay.
Mhm.
I knew I was in the south. Like the second day I went to the cafeteria and they had like grits and stuff like that. Like, what is this? You know what I'm saying? I knew that was different, right? And what happens, I was not social. I wasn't into the dancing and things of that sort. And I was not listening to the music that many of my friends were listening to. What changed me was my roommate, Reggie Hudgens, who's deceased now. But Reggie came in from Philadelphia with the Philadelphia groove. All of a sudden, I was into the Delphonics. Okay,
Oh,
I was into
yes.
the Delphonics. I was into the Intruders. I was into that Philly groove music, right? And then, the person that changed my life on many levels was my first wife, Michelle Calhoun. And Michelle Calhoun from Chicago, cousin Smokey Robinson, father, Eddie Calhoun, bass player for when you put on that Earl Gardner and you see them playing Misty. That's my first father-in-law playing the bass. She came from a musical family, right? And she came from Chicago. And one day she said, "Oh, Ethelbert, come with me. I want you to meet somebody." And took me over to Douglas Hall, and that's where I saw and met Donnell Lee, who
Mm,
was from
mhm,
Chicago.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
I would not meet Donnell Lee if it wasn't for Michelle Calhoun. And so she changed my ear, the music. She changed what I was reading because she was heavy into science fiction. She read the Godfather book in one day because she read very fast. She didn't go to class, but that's another story. but what happened, I say that because if I hadn't met her, I would not have been pulled in to African American music. If I had not come to Howard and had teachers like Jennifer Jordan, and meet people like Sterling Brown and Arthur B. Davis, I would not have been pulled in to African American literature. So when I look at my background, Dylan to me and Paul Simon to me is for those kids who went to the good schools reading Herman Melville and Walt Whitman. You know, I didn't know anything about Langston Hughes until I got to Howard. I didn't really know. I went to Paul Laurence Dunbar Junior High School in the Bronx. Nobody ever taught me a Dunbar poem. Okay, so when I'm coming to Washington D.C., I'm leaving all my folk roots, the music that I really love, and that's why I'm very honest when people say, "Oh yes, I walked in the library, I saw Baldwin, I read all of Baldwin." Oh no, I didn't do that. I was reading Black Beauty and Flicker. What I'm saying. And I was just being honest. I
Yeah.
grew up. I said Bob Dylan, Donovan. Buffy St. Marie, those are the people, the Birds, doing Blowing in the Wind, not Dylan, Blowing in the Wind, but the Birds. And I liked my man Sunglasses. That's what I was into. But, and then I would say, true, the other thing coinciding with the folk music was the coming of the Beatles and that whole English sound. I got into that. And after that, I got into that whole Beach Boys, so, and that has to do with the fact that I'm at a high school that's predominantly white.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking about my days in the summer going up and down the radio because we didn't have streaming. You couldn't create your own playlist. So if you had eclectic musical taste, I was going from WHUR to WPGC to WOOK, et cetera. So that's DC for
Right.
folks who aren't familiar with DC's radio stations. Yeah.
Mhm. Oh, and I say that, I'm glad you say that because the radio station for me would be WBAI. Okay.
Yes,
And then
yes.
and the person I was listening to, I think his show was coming out of Greenwich Village, was Gene Shepard.
Mhm.
We tell these little stories, sort of like Woody Guthrie. We tell these little stories, and so I really enjoyed that. Shaped my background also.
Ethelbert, when you mentioned your first wife introducing you to new music and bringing something else to your ears, I'm thinking of in A Complete Unknown, the women who were influential in Bob Dylan's life. They don't have a big role in the film. Joan Baez, I would say, has the biggest role. But there's also Susie Rotrollo. I mean, she's not called Susie Rotrollo. That's the real person.
Right.
Elle Fanning plays another character with a different name. What were your impressions of how these women influenced the Bob Dylan character as we see in the movie?
Well, I think Susie Rozola is very important because she's on that album cover, with Dylan. So if you're going to dress Dylan with this attire, his coats and stuff like that, that's an iconic picture, okay. And to me, what the movie does is flesh out that photograph, okay. So we realize who she is, and then you get a sense in terms of how important women are to Dylan, that some of these songs probably would not have been written if he wasn't going through that sort of like lovers triangle. And I feel that that's what the movie is. The movie is a lovers triangle, which is similar to many films, have that triangle. And so in that case, I like that. I do feel also that Joan Baez is fleshed out. I knew they were singing, but I didn't know they were this deep love affair type of thing, to the point that you see this sort of jealousy between the two women. One I think I felt was missing in the film. You never see Susie and Joan talk. There's never that conversation between two women. Now maybe this is me looking at how um, coming through the feminist movement, people was like, maybe women have changed in terms of, maybe you can talk about, even the sister can talk about this, but I just felt that maybe the film directed by a woman, you could get that conversation, okay, that gives you a better sense of what the man is going through. Okay, I didn't know, for example, looking at that film, which woman was closer to Bob Dylan. And say,
Interesting point.
I wouldn't know. I knew that one, she's jealous that she's listening at the performing, they're singing each other. But we know that even though they're singing to each other, they had a hard time. They were trying to resolve. They just had a concert, like a contract to fulfill. That's why they're on the stage together at the festival. But I never knew exactly what they saw in each other. It seems as if, for example, Susie was much closer to Dylan than, say, Joan. Um, and then it seems as if you don't know whether the careers are competitive, because she was big time when he met her, and then his career surpassed her, the same way his career surpasses Pete Seeger. So you never know what's driving these characters, and this is where you can't do that everything in a movie. But I do feel that if I had seen a scene where the two women in a cafe or something just had this conversation, I would do it. I'm concerned about how the woman, I think it's Staples, I think is in the movie, the black woman. This was this, yeah, that's so brief that
Well, she had a British accent, so I don't
Yeah,
no.
that's
I couldn't
She was
place
supposed to
her.
be like, I think she was supposed to be like Staples or something like that. But I think she's actually the real character. Okay. But what happens is that the way that's presented on the film, I felt it was very disrespectful to black women,
Mm.
because she just popped up at this party, and then she says, I love you. And he says, well, we just met. Well, where did you meet? I mean, it is as if they came into the party, into this house party together, so they were a couple, but we don't know how they met. And then obviously she says like, I love you. And he said, well, we just, I mean, it adds to the comedy of because the film is also very funny with these little lines. But I feel in that sense, the joke is at the expense of black women,
Hmm.
because there's not that many black women in the place.
true. Yeah. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the film yet. And I'm wondering, actually, did the Mavis Staples character get cut on? Well, we don't do the cutting room floor anymore. It's digitally done.
Right.
But I do wonder if that character actually did not appear in the film, even though it's listed, Mavis Staples is listed as, excuse me, as one of the people who's supposed to be a character in the film. But as Michon pointed out, that woman who came in had
That
a
wasn't
British accent, and she had seemed to have not even a name. We don't even know what her name
But look at
was.
but double check the casting on that, because I think
I
in the
will.
casting listing, I think there is a reference to it.
There is to Mavis Staples,
Right.
but it doesn't
Okay.
seem to be that
That
character.
character.
Yeah, yeah.
I will
Okay.
go
Right.
I will go on record. That was not Mavis
Okay.
Staples.
But I'm glad we did bring up the thing about the English language, because one of the things that I feel is missing, which is key, if we don't see Dylan in London, where he's trying out his music and people are just booing him on the stage and stuff like that. The way they're booing him at that festival is the way they would boo him in England, because he was, people say, I can't hear the words and this and that. And I thought that I was trying to figure out when that London tour took place and why that was not incorporated into the film, because that's right around the time, like a Rolling Stone. I mean, that's a key song that he's singing overseas, and they want to hear Blowing in the Wind, the old classics.
Right.
But I felt that was one of the things that maybe because of budget, you can't go over and do that. I don't know. I did feel that the Greenwich Village scenes, street scenes, were done very nicely.
Yeah, yeah, it really gave you a sense of the village at that time. And, it's pretty much a formation film. He mentions Buddy Holly. He mentions Little Richard. His biography, he talks about discovering Woody Guthrie, but his roots actually were rock and roll or rock, or I got to see transition to rock, but it was rock and roll. And
No,
then
I'll
he
go back.
discovered the folk.
I'll challenge that, because when you see with that film is very important. He comes looking for Woody Guthrie.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, after he discovers Woody Guthrie's records.
right. And
Yeah,
I think that if you say, okay, who's influencing the folk scene, it's Woody Guthrie.
right,
Okay.
right. Yeah,
And so I think that's very important. And I think what's really is interesting is the trips that he's taking and visiting him, and you get a sense, okay, oh, here's this harmonica I want you to play. I felt that was very good with sort of Pete Seeger framing it right there. I felt there was a sort of this sort of continuity, musical continuity, which I felt was very important. The same way, you begin to see that there's the blues represented in his development. And
right,
and those are things I think have a lot to do with why we honor him today.
right. Because he actually had a lot of influences.
Exactly. And American influences.
Yes, yes.
I just did a little search, just want to reference that London
What year was that?
performance. 1966, he was at Royal Albert Hall.
So that comes after
It
65.
comes after, yeah. Yeah,
Right.
because the film takes us from 1961 to 1965.
Right. And what I felt was done really well, is you see him driving off in a motorcycle, and we know that in 66 he's going to have an accident.
Spoiler alert, spoiler
Okay,
alert.
okay, all right, okay, right, all right,
It's still, you can still enjoy the film.
right.
Let's transition to another decade or year, 2016. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Dylan seems to question, and he received the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature, and he questioned why he was awarded this prize that's usually given to writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Toni Morrison, fiction writers, poets. And then there are those writers he mentions who were not awarded, such as George Bernard Shaw, Ernest Hemingway, and others. His direct quote is, "Are my songs literature?" What came to your mind when you learned Bob Dylan received this prize for literature? I was one of those people who was surprised.
Well, what I'm being a literary activist. I'm not surprised by the politics of who gets these awards, because I always feel the awards moves around, where all of a sudden somebody in the Middle East may get the award, somebody in Asia may get the award. And then there's always saying, "Oh, when is an American writer going to win it?" Well, for example, when Toni Morrison won it, for example, and then this is just me making this up. Someone went down the hall and told Joyce Carol Oates that she's not going to get the Nobel Prize in her lifetime because what are the odds of two people in the same floor getting the Nobel Prizes? Okay, but it has a lot to do with American literature in general, where you say, okay, who are the major American writers? So you're running short of people to give. I mean, you talk about George Carol Oates at that time, maybe Philip Roth. Okay, I always promote Charles Johnson because I think he has a body of work. The next black person I feel who will get a Nobel Prize, if I was betting, I would say Edwidge Danticat, because she's come from Haiti and she's done a body of
Edwidge
work.
Danticat.
Yeah, I see that. But we're not there where you have your Hemingways and your Faulkners. I mean, if we went into like a college or high school and say, who are the American writer that you're reading that's not banned, you just can't come to a consensus. So if you're saying like we're going to honor an American, I put Dylan now, especially after seeing this movie. When I just look at what he composed between 61 and 65, get out of here.
19,
Exactly. And keep in mind, for many times when we give out these awards, okay, and we can even use like Langston Hughes, sometimes we're honoring people for work that they did when they were very young. If you look at Langston Hughes and how he's anthologized, okay, many of those poems he wrote when he was very, very, very young, okay? Langston goes through many changes, just like Bob Dylan. Okay, so what happens? There's going to be that period of people saying, "I don't like these Dylan songs," or "I don't like the Langston Hughes poems of the 1930s."
Right,
you
right.
have that,
And Amiri Baraka, similarly.
right.
I like Leroy Jones. I don't like Amiri Baraka, right?
Right. And what happened? Even if you like Amiri Baraka, you like the Amiri Baraka who is like the Black Arts Movement, but that Marxist-Leninist stuff, you like say, "Oh, no, I didn't want to listen to that." You know what I'm saying? And that has a lot to do when we now say, okay, we're going to give somebody these big awards. Okay, we're going to give somebody that. Because when you say the Nobel Prize, it's not like the Pulitzer Prize or the Booker where you wrote this book this year. It's for that lifetime achievement. And because of that, and because when we look at least in terms of we're teaching African American literature, we know that we teach the oral literature alongside the Phyllis Wheatley and everybody else who has a book. Okay, so when we say literature, okay, it's oral literature also. Okay. And in that case, now you can see the Academy, the people giving out the Nobel Prize, expanding that definition of writer, songwriter are going to be included next to our novel. I mean, they were giving it to playwrights.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So what happens if you're going to give it to a playwright? I guess a screenwriter would come next, But what happens is that the definition has been broadened. And this is happening to us in every field. So Kendrick Lamar gets a Pulitzer Prize, and it sends, for those of us who are traditional, It's almost like in sports, we prefer the pocket passer to the guy scrambling around, you know. But that's just us being purists. That's us being. I think what happens at the end of the day, it is good to acknowledge this connection because this is how we should teach the literature. We should teach Dylan the same way we would teach Whitman. Okay, and maybe we should teach Woody Guthrie because what are we saying? The literature comes from the people. Woody Guthrie's out there in the Dust Bowls. Woody Guthrie's the cowboy songs that he's borrowing. Okay, and that is a part of America. No different than I'm studying under Stephen Henderson, and he puts out the Understanding New Black Poetry. And what does he do? He puts in blues lyrics. Okay, when I do my In Search of Color Everywhere anthology, drawing on people like Henderson and others, I got Public Enemy in there. I got James Brown. Now
Right.
people say, well, Ethelbert, you didn't include me in your anthology. I include Smokey Robinson.
Yeah. I
I
mean,
just
they're quotable, right?
not only are they quotable, it's the essence of when you say, let's just say poetry. The key thing with poetry is the line,
Mm-hmm.
not the sense, the line. One of the things I like about Dylan, I walked around like just lines, like lay, lady, lay. I wasn't even dating anybody. Lay, lady, lay across my big brass bed. I didn't even have I had a bed propped up by some cylinder blocks. You know what I'm saying? I didn't have a mattress. Lay, lady, lay. I thought that was very romantic. But what happens, and then there was one line that I wound up quoting. It's on the back of, I guess, liner notes. It was back of notes. Very prophetic. It's a line that says, I accept chaos. I don't know if chaos accepts me. I walked around with that for days. And then there's the other one that the line is, sometimes even the president of the United States has to stand naked. I thought of Bill Clinton when that song came out. I went back to that. But I say that in terms of the humor of Dylan, Dylan in terms of the political music, the Hurricane, Carter, not knocking that was for the Billy the Kid film,
Not knocking at
on
heaven's
the
door.
door. And then when you talk about, and this happened to me around the time of getting Dylan. Dylan, I think, also had me listen to Jimi Hendrix again because I like All Along the Watchtower. So I was a Dylan song. I was getting into Jimi Hendrix also. But when I got the first Jimi Hendrix song was Hey Joe. I got into that. Okay. And then 6 was 9. But
Yeah.
I did not get pulled into Jimi Hendrix as much as I got pulled in to Dylan. But as you can see here, for me, it was an instrument. It was the guitar, okay, that was pulling me in, and in my household, I was taught to play the piano. And in my family, my son played the piano, my brother played the piano and the organ, but that was a different thing, you know. I think if I was in the Southern and I had a grandfather, playing the harmonica or that, I tried the harmonica. I was trying to be like little Stevie Wonder, but it was never, I was always concerned what would happen to my lips. And I haven't really kissed anybody, but I was always like, I don't want to blow a trumpet to have a little, muscular thing on my lip. And, you go to kiss somebody. I got it.
And then you have that thing around your neck like Dylan had, so you can
Right. You know what I'm saying? And so this is why folk music for me, made me get through my my transition because you could always, even if you couldn't play guitar, you could lean into a woman and pluck a few things like I'm trying to play this for you, you know. And there is a romanticism that occurs. And I think when you look at people who are hanging out in the clubs, okay, and this makes a transition for me. I was listening to those. I look at those images, and then later on, when I come to Howard, along with Michelle influenced me. That's when I changed. I got into jazz, and so what happened at Howard? I got into John Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders. Okay, and as you can see there, I'm leaving Dylan and Phil Oakes and others for lyrics, and now I'm getting into the sound.
Mm.
Okay, and I could look at John Coltrane the same way we look at Dylan. Because you take Baraka, right? I remember Baraka saying like, "Yeah, I could get in love with three, but when John Coltrane started playing Om, and he said that was a little too far out for me." In the same way, I like the fact that Coltrane goes through the spiritual transformation. You see Dylan going through this transformation in this film. Okay, he's
Yeah.
not articulate,
Yes.
but the fact like something's pulling him. And this is why I feel I would have liked those two women coming together, Susie and Joan, to say, okay, what's happening to this man that we both love? What's he struggling with? What are there demons here? Okay. And keep in mind, we don't have any flashbacks of family or anything like that. We don't know anything. He just arrives in New York.
Yeah.
Right.
We don't talk about Minnesota too much.
Exactly.
No.
Exactly.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation.
Let's talk about the source of this film, which is a book by Elijah Wald, who's been on your radio show On the Margin. Elijah Wald wrote the book Dylan Goes Electric in 2015. So this is what A Complete Unknown is based on. And you sent me a link to Bob Dylan's Facebook post where he says, quote, "After you've seen the movie, read the book," unquote. Now, I also learned that Elijah Wald co-authored memoir by Dan Van Ronk, who is also a folk artist, musician. It's called The Mayor of McDougal Street. And that was the inspiration for the 2013 Coen Brothers film Inside Llewyn Davis. Now, past guests on this podcast have said dramatic films fill in the emotional piece, which you don't get in the book about a certain individual, or even if there's a documentary about a certain individual. How do you see A Complete Unknown or any film adapted from a nonfiction book being a boost, maybe even a bust for reading the book and filling in that emotional piece that they may not get in the book? What is the role of film within this whole circle
Well, I
of
think
the story?
right. I think you're dealing with Elijah Wald, and you're right. I interviewed him twice. I only found out about Elijah Wald because I interviewed Patty Harrigan, and she was the author of the August Wilson biography, and she said, "Oh, this might be another person that you might be interested in interviewing." So I was not familiar with Elijah Wald's work, but I tell you this: doing 2 interviews with him, and maybe this is what Dylan sees. He's not only writing about the music, he plays the music. I mean, he's a performer, you know. And I think about him and the guy who did the big book on Sonny Rollins, that if you have an author or a writer who is not just writing about the music, but who plays the music, it's a completely different type of biography. They can go back and play something and say, okay, I see the changes that you make. Okay. Somebody else is just listening to records and tapes. Okay. So it's completely different. Elijah Wald has a really good historical knowledge. Okay. Historical knowledge. So what happens is that if you're writing a biography, in between the chapters, you're getting something that you say, if you were to, he's writing about you say, oh, I didn't know that. You know, he's looking at the bigger picture. He say, okay, this is what's going on while you're playing on such and such street. Okay. He can do, this is where your music, this is where your instrument comes from. Okay. And I mean, Elijah Wald's just amazing in terms of he plays really well. That's the thing. I listen to him play very well. So it's not somebody who's like, you know, it's like a pastime. He's actually performing. And how he finds the time to write or the time to listen to material, I would compare it to, just to bring her name in because we're talking about folk, I compare it to Verda Mae Grosvenor because I remember Verda Mae when she was at NPR. I remember going to her office and she introduced me to Zornia Hurston. The same way Woody Guthrie got these recordings, you know, like the Library of Congress, stuff like that, Smithsonian has now. I heard, you know, Zornia Hurston there. And here was Verda Mae listening to Zornia Hurston. So she could just talk about Zornia Hurston, but she's listening. Same thing with Elijah Wald. You're listening to the music, okay, playing as well as you're taking notes and writing, but you're listening to music. So your biography comes out and it has a different sound. Okay, the same way if you're performing and somebody is classically trained, they can say, "Oh, Michon, you hit the wrong note." Okay, now in scholarship, that's somebody checking your footnotes
Right.
and
Yeah.
say, "Okay, well, you see, you thought this happened there, but so and so's book that you didn't go to the primary source. That's why it's wrong." Okay, and I think Elijah Wald, he's listening to stuff. He went to like Julie Moore Moulton. He like all these lyrics. I mean, you were talking about a big book of Dylan.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an
Yeah.
It's
encyclopedia,
enough.
really.
And I have this book here my friend gave me down there, which in Miami, of just his paintings.
And
This
that's
big
Dylan's paintings.
Dylan painting, and it's Dylan painting. I put this bad boy. When you had to check your luggage, I put it in there because I couldn't put it in my handbag like a normal book. And then when I was talking to my friend Rebecca, who gave me the book, I thought it was paintings that Dylan did, and then he also collected artwork. But she said, no, it's all of his artwork. I said, all these different styles? He said, yes. I found that amazing. That is as amazing as when I'm talking about he wrote all these songs in this short span of time. And then my friend says this to me, "Oh, Ethelbert, you should see the sculpture."
What I love about these nonfiction music books, biographies, you want to call them biographies or documents of a certain time, a certain genre, is that they do make you go back and listen to the music.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And
I've been listening to a lot of
can't
Dylan
even get
lately.
yeah, I can't even get through the book because I gotta go back, you see a reference and you're like, "Oh, let
Right.
me listen to this and see what this author is talking about." And I remember that happened to me when I read the Quincy Troop Miles Davis memoir. I was in the record store
Mm. Yeah.
after reading that.
Right. But but see, someone would say that's you doing critical reading. That's how you're supposed to read it. See?
Right.
And the same way I find now, and this gets into the thing if you're teachers, do you keep this smartphone out of the classroom? I remember giving a talk in a high school. This is a couple years ago, and a kid was looking up stuff while I was talking. I'm like, "Oh, August Wilson, I didn't know who that was," and so it's a something that's adds to a child's education because he or she is using a device, to enhance what you are saying in the classroom
In real time.
in real time.
Yeah.
It's not a distraction.
Let's talk a little more about Wald's book, Dylan Goes Electric. It's also the story of Pete Seeger.
Well, I like the character. I like the Pete Seeger character in the movie. He seems so sweet, And this is the thing. Remember, I've told you as about the women talking. What it says so much is Pete Seeger brings Dylan into his home, his Toshi, the kid. I felt that says something about folk music. That you play with people, you leave, and it's a family. And I think that what happened, he had a family. He didn't have like go back to a hotel room and get high together.
Right.
And while he's there, he's composing a song, and it might be a script or whatever, but it is a thing like saying, okay, I'm composing songs that even your children who are in this room will understand and listen to. It's a family setting, you know. Um, and that I found that very interesting. I would be concerned about the fact that Toshi usually isn't giving any lines, you know.
But she has a
Um,
couple.
well, then she's like the
I'm
Asian.
not sure
She's like
she gets.
the quiet Asian woman.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what I felt I was seeing there,
Wasn't sh-
especially when there was the thing at the not her, I was
At the
okay, alert,
concert.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
where she no, don't pull the plug,
Right.
okay?
Yeah.
You know, but I felt that I would have liked her to interact with Dylan because she must be very important because Bernice Reagan named her daughter after Toshi. So Toshi
Yes.
definitely
Yes.
is has a presence. And I think the same way, even though when you see images of Yoko Ono and John Lennon, like Yoko Ono's very quiet, even though Yoko Ono had a career long before John Lennon,
Yes.
and
Yes.
very brilliant in terms of theory and stuff like that. But she doesn't ever say anything. She's just quiet. Okay. And I felt that was what I saw happening on the screen in the Dylan film into a complete
Yeah.
unknown. Now, that might be very interesting to see somebody who's Asian who sees that film and pick that out. The same way, because of my background, I'm looking at women characters.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting too. I mean, the film also shows different pathways around the music. So, and this comes out in Elijah Wald's book. Pete Seeger was very interested in music as a way to build community and social consciousness. And so he put himself in the background, and it was the song that was most important. And then you have someone like Alan Lomax, who is actually recording, preserving, more aligned with Pete in that they're trying to make sure that music from, field hollers, Dust Bowl, whatever the source, survives. So they're documenting history, but also trying to keep develop an audience for it. Dylan is the artist. And so, like an artist, his pathway diverges. He's not interested in preservation. He's interested in bringing forward all these various influences. So, you kind of combined for me some of these aspects of these three men. You mentioned the anthology that you put together. You have mentored other poets and writers. You also are someone who is a poet. And I want to reference the fact that in his biography, Dylan calls himself at one point a poet musician. Um, Talk about the role of preservation, the kind of work that Lomax and Seeger were doing as their life missions. Why is it important to be documenting, continuing to teach, pass on work from previous generations? And what could be lost if there aren't preservationists also in the world of culture and the arts?
Well, you mentioned Lomax. I throw in Zora Neale Hurston because I think that they were down there
Zora,
together,
yes,
right?
absolutely, absolutely.
And she's documenting that. Then I would go up to my mentor, Stephen Henderson, and he was at Howard University when the Institute for Arts and Humanities was created. Okay, Stephen Henderson was always aware of folk culture, the oral tradition. As I mentioned in his Anthology Understanding New Black Poetry, he incorporates the blues lyrics as poetry. He brought Sterling Brown out of retirement. When we look at the documentation of folklore, Sterling Brown becomes extremely important. People think of Sterling Brown as a poet, but we need to look at Sterling Brown as a social historian.
Yeah.
And the folklore is very, very important. Under Stephen Henderson's mentorship, we had not just the African American Writers Conference, but we had the first African American Folk Conference, and that brought people like Worth Long. It gave Roland Freeman, the photographer,
Yes.
bring his work in. So what happens is that the documentation, and this goes back to Andrew Billingsley, who created the Institute for Arts and Humanities. He saw the Institute for Arts and Humanities, along with some of the other institutes that he created, to be these sort of force fields in between departments and community. Okay,
The interdisciplinary.
not just interdisciplinary, but serving as a way between departments as well as community. Okay, now one of the things built into the institute probably has a lot to do with what I was doing before the institute was created. When I was in the dorm, and I made reference to my roommate Reggie Hudgens, and that was my connection to Philadelphia and the Philadelphia groove music and Delphonics and stuff like that. But next door on the other side was my friend Steve Jones. Okay, and Steve Jones was older than me. He was more mature. When we were going having a little water fights, he thought we were just strange Negroes, who would eventually make it to the middle class if we were good. But what happened is that Steve happened to work for Margaret Burroughs at the DuSable Museum in Chicago.
Yeah.
And what happened, she instructed Steve, like, oh, I want to get something from Sterling Brown, maybe it's a pipe or something that for her museum. So what happened, Steve tells me, hey, I'm going over to Sterling Brown's house in Brooklyn, and I said, oh, I'll tag along. And I tagged along with the video camera. We were the video camera, it's like, you're the only person with a cell phone on, and everybody wants to use it to call home. Now, we had the video, nobody else had a video, nobody videotaping, right? And we go over, I tag along and set it up to interview, just listening to Steve Jones ask Sterling Brown some questions. We had no training in oral history or anything like that. We just said, put the thing in there. He said, yes, I'll come back. I got a lot more to tell you guys. Daisy, get them something. He was so happy that we would document later. So we started doing the tapes. Now, Henderson said, this is what we should be doing. He saw the importance of it. So when the Institute is created, he brought in, make sure it had a documentation unit. Now, to show you the importance of it, okay, you made reference to, in my bio notes, Furious Flower, Lifetime Achievement Award. That Furious Flower Conference was started by Joanne Gabin, okay, down at James Madison University. Joanne Gabin, thesis, first book was on Sterling Brown. She doesn't have a book unless me and Steve Jones go over to record it. Bless her heart, she made sure that she drew that upon that material. Now, this is interesting in terms of documentation. We shot a lot of things. Six Pan-African Congress, we saw every time Farrakhan came up on campus, we shot a lot of things. But the few tapes that we transcribed was the Sterling Brown tapes. So someone like Joanne Gabin, a scholar, could come and use that material from off those tapes because it's the transcripts. You see what I'm saying? Now, why is that important? We can document stuff. Yeah, and you got a cassette player.
Right. Yeah. That's why we transcribe the podcast too.
And see what happened. Why does this come in? Because along with Bob Dylan, and I have a little Black Power book by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, I was into Marshall McLuhan as well as I was into Bob Dylan. And I knew that print is the key thing, the Gutenberg Bible. Print is the essence. Everything else is on top. And what happened, we didn't have the money to transcribe all the tape, but that would have been it because the technology is constantly changing.
Yes.
As a visionary, like a Buckminster Fuller type of guy, I decide, arguing with Henderson, we need to transfer these things to cassette tapes. Yeah, right. Real. And who has that? The technology keeps changing.
Yes.
You see? But I can open a book. I don't have to look for a device to play it. You see? And this is a thing where I felt the documentation was very, very important. And I say this because unless there's a Bob Dylan coming along, a lot of those tapes would be like Woody Guthrie with no visitors. Okay? Because what happens, stuff is stored and a whole new staff comes in. They don't know what's in. And sometimes somebody says, oh, we got a new space for a monitor. Let's clear that out and put something in there. And not knowing the value. There's a lot of valuable stuff that is there that because I was around people documenting stuff, that was key. And I also was learning how to read, making reference to Stephen Henderson. When we would have new books come into the African Resource Center, Henderson would pass by on his way to his office. He would come in to see what new books were there. He taught me how to read. Taquiena boys, this is what he did. He'd take a book, new book come in, go straight to the back. And takes it back, check those footnotes, and what happens, he's like, say, no, there's nothing here. If now he saw that somebody was using documents from some special collection, then he would say, okay, this might be something new. Other than that, it's just somebody's new interpretation of Marcus Garvey or Du Bois. It's the same. It's the same material. And so what happens? The key thing is not just documenting, but getting back to Elijah Wald. If people are not going to come, we do not direct scholars to use this material. We don't do anything. You see, we're having a time right now where I interviewed her like I interviewed Elijah Wald, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who just did this beautiful biography of Audre Lorde. Well, there is a need for another generation. Okay, we're at a point where it's Kaveri Khanum and spoken word. We need to make sure that we are training individuals who are literary critics, not frustrated poets, who want to write an essay about Gwendolyn Brooks. No, critics. That's all they want to do. Okay, that there's a sort of detachment, and what happened? The critical, analysis is key. If I go back and look at some of the things that Stephen Henderson was writing about, and when we got publishing his essays in February, he was always talking about protecting African American culture. He saw African American culture being under attack. Okay, now take that and compare this to what we're going through there in terms of a few months. We'll have a new administration coming in, and if you look at what's happening in Florida and Texas, erasure, just taking things like it never happened.
Right. Yeah.
January 6th didn't really happen. I mean, and so what happens? This form of erasure, this is very dangerous. So you want to say, okay, no, this is the actual documentation. Okay, and keep in mind, we have not really seen the actual documentation of January 6th. We have not seen a book come out that they say, okay, like, wow, this wasn't on PBS. They didn't mention this on CNN. Yeah, there's something in there. Just like how Henderson would look at those footnotes. Yeah, there's something in here on page 385 that was really serious. Somebody cornered Nancy Pelosi in the bathroom and she pleaded her way out. We don't know. you know what I'm saying?
Right,
Michon looked at me. It's just a reference, Michon. That's all it is.
Yeah, we don't have all the stories yet.
Yeah, we don't have all the stories. And then getting back to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, those stories that they're recording, those songs, that's America. Okay, that's America. And that's the America that many times we don't know. That's the America beyond the 13 colonies. Okay, that's the America beyond the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, that's the America that gets into Alaska and Hawaii. Okay, and then for those who are in the Trump administration, it's also Puerto Rico. And once you hear those songs, if you listen to Woody Guthrie, it will make you an environmentalist. It'll make you believe in climate change. It'll make you respect the indigenous people. Okay,
right?
And it also, forget about the Democratic Party. It will teach you about working people who survived the dust storms. They will teach you about the history. And what are we saying? When I look at Woody Guthrie, because of where he's from, and I'm a baseball guy, so I say let's highlight the importance of Oklahoma. Woody Guthrie, Ralph Ellison, and Mickey Mantle. That sounds like some sort of trilogy, doesn't it?
Well, you sound like Bob Dylan in his biography, lifting up the people from Minnesota.
Yeah. Hello, Prince.
Yeah.
I did notice in Wald's book that he mentioned Dylan doing interviews with Studs Terkel.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
another documentarian. Yeah,
I like. I never met Studs Terkel, but what I did meet Harry Moore. Harry Moore used to be the associate editor of Nation magazine, and Harry Moore is the author of Not Working. It's just take off of working, and Harry interviewed all these people who hated their jobs. And it's called Not Working. But I say that because Studs Terkel is key. And I would say that was some of the things that we were trying to do at Howard, have these type of things and record. And this is where we have to look up ways to preserve things. Like Kojo just ended the show. Imagine
Kojo Nnamdi.
Imagine if we had all the Kojo shows. They would have a more interesting history about DC. They had guests and stuff, or all the shows that were on Evening Exchange. Okay,
right,
Marion Barry's first interview, those things become very, very important if I'm a biographer.
Original source material.
Exactly.
In part 2 of our conversation with Ethelbert Miller about A Complete Unknown and Bob Dylan, we talk about teaching Dylan's Chronicles Volume 1 memoir and the role of the artist as a witness to history.
How much does this film help a young person who doesn't know about Dylan, who gets pulled in to it? And then it leads to a discussion in terms of the Civil Rights Movement, the War in Vietnam, all these other things of that time. Realize that this is the soundtrack of that period.
Searchlight Pictures, A Complete Unknown, is currently in theaters. Do a search to find out where the film is playing near you and when the film will be streaming. You can purchase the books mentioned in this conversation from our affiliate bookstore, including Elijah Wald's Dylan Goes Electric, Newport, Seeger, Dylan, and the Night That Split the Sixties, Bob Dylan's memoir Chronicles Volume 1, and his collection, The Lyrics, and Ethelbert Miller's memoir, Fathering Words, as well as The Little Book of E poems. Your book purchases support independent bookstores in your community, and a small commission supports the historical drama with the Boston Sisters podcast. Go to our website at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters or the podcast description for the link to the affiliate bookstore. Sign up for the e-newsletter to stay up to date on new podcasts, bonus episodes, and historical drama-related resources and activities. You can find the link on the webpage as well.
Share this podcast with someone you know who will enjoy the conversation. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts. Leave a review. Michon and I hope you'll give the podcast 5 stars. Follow us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michon Boston.
And this is Taquiena Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michon Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michon Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michon Boston.
And this is Taquiena Boston. Thank you for listening.